Imagine flying 5 miles above the Earth in a frozen metal tube, knowing your odds of survival are mathematically impossible. You are a 20-year-old kid. The enemy is the most advanced air force in the world, and they have just figured out the fatal flaw in your aircraft. In 1943, during the bloodiest phase of the World War II air war, the German Luftwaffe was slaughtering American B-17s at a rate that terrified Allied command. They thought they had the bombers beat, but they didn't count on a single B-17 named Tondelayo, a miraculous act of sabotage deep inside a Nazi weapons factory, and a rebellious tail gunner named Michael Arooth, who threw away the Army rulebook to unleash a secret weapon that shattered the morale of Germany's finest pilots. Today, we declassify the physics, the psychology, and the incredible true story of the mission where one man forced 17 German fighters to break and run. The year is 1943. High above the fractured landscape of occupied Europe, a war of attrition is being fought that defies human comprehension. This is not the war of the muddy infantrymen or the churning tank treads of the Eastern Front. This is a war of oxygen masks, frostbite, and the thin, screaming air of 5 miles up. In the cockpits and cramped gun turrets of the United States 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, survival isn't measured in years or months, it's measured in seconds. The odds were mathematically impossible. A bomber crewman was statistically more likely to die than a soldier in the trenches of World War I. To complete a tour of duty, 25 missions was considered a miracle. Most didn't make it to 5. The German Luftwaffe, the most experienced and technologically advanced air force in the world at that moment, had turned the sky into a vertical slaughterhouse. The Germans had mastered the art of the intercept. They weren't just shooting at planes, they were dismantling a philosophy. The American belief in the self-defending bomber, the idea that a formation of B-17 flying fortresses could fight its way to any target and back without fighter escort, was being bled white. The Luftwaffe pilots, the Experten, had found the flaws in the armor. They knew every blind spot, every hesitation, and every mechanical limitation of the American heavy bombers. But amidst the smoke of burning B-17s, one plane would become a legend. A plane named Tondelayo. And inside that plane sat a man who would do something the Luftwaffe deemed impossible. He didn't have a new radar or a prototype laser. He had a secret weapon that the Germans couldn't understand until it was too late. This weapon would eventually be credited with a feat so staggering it remains a cornerstone of aerial gunnery lore: the disruption and destruction of an entire enemy onslaught. To understand how one man could destroy the morale of the Luftwaffe's finest, we have to understand the environment of 1943. The mighty 8th was based in East Anglia, England. The airfields were carved out of cow pastures and sleepy villages. To the locals, the B-17s were queen of the skies. To the men who flew them, they were flying coffins. Every morning, the ritual was the same. The wake-up officers would move through the Nissen huts at 3 a.m., a flashlight in the eyes, a quiet voice saying, "Briefing at 4:30. The men would dress in layers, heavy long johns, the Blue Bunny heated suits that often short-circuited and burned the skin, the fleece-lined flight suits, the Mae West life vests, and finally the heavy flak vests. They looked like knights in clumsy electric armor. They would eat a breakfast of real eggs, a luxury reserved for those who might not see lunch, and then head to the briefing room. There, the map would be covered by a curtain. When the curtain was pulled back, a red string would stretch across the North Sea deep into the heart of the Third Reich, places like Bremen, Kiel, Schweinfurt, and Kassel. The meat grinder was real. In 1 week in October 1943, later known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 1,480 bombers. That's 1,480 men, dead, captured, or wounded in just 4 days. The German pilots were getting bolder. They were using new tactics, head-on attacks that gave the bomber gunners less than 2 seconds to react. They were using rockets, the Werfer Granate 21, which could be fired from outside the range of the bomber's 50 caliber guns. The Americans were desperate. They needed a hero. They needed a miracle. And they needed a way to change the math of the air war. They didn't know that the answer was already sitting in the tail gunner position of a B-17F, serial number 4229896. Michael Arooth was a man who didn't care for manuals. He didn't care for established doctrine. He saw the sky differently. While other gunners were taught to wait until the enemy was within 400 yards, Aruth was doing the math in his head. He was preparing to unleash a secret weapon that the Germans couldn't understand until it was too late. This weapon would eventually be credited with a feat so staggering it remains a cornerstone of aerial gunnery lore: the disruption and destruction of an entire enemy onslaught. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The name itself was a piece of propaganda that happened to be partially true. By 1943, the B-17 was the backbone of the American strategic bombing effort. It was a four-engine masterpiece of pre-war engineering designed to be rugged, reliable, and bristling with machine guns. In its most common 1943 configuration, the B-17F, it carried 10 to 12 50 caliber Mach 2 Browning machine guns. These were the legendary MAD-2s. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. The muzzle velocity was nearly 3,000 feet per second. A single hit from a 50 caliber round could tear an engine off a fighter or decapitate a pilot. But for all its firepower, the B-17 was a victim of its own design evolution. Let's look at the layout. You had the nose gunner and the navigator or bombardier in the plexiglass nose. You had the top turret located just behind the cockpit, which could rotate 360 degrees. You had the ball turret, the most claustrophobic and dangerous job in the world, hanging from the belly. You had the waist gunners standing at open windows where the temperature could drop to 60 degrees below zero. And finally, you had the tail gunner, tucked in the very rear of the fuselage. The problem was the blind spots. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe realized that the B-17's nose was its Achilles heel. The early models had very little forward-facing firepower. The German aces, led by men like Egon Meyer, developed a 12 Uhr Angriff, the 12 o'clock high attack. They would fly miles ahead of the bomber formation, turn, and dive straight at the noses of the lead bombers. The closing speed was over 500 miles per hour. The American gunners had maybe 1.5 seconds to acquire the target, lead it, and fire. It was like trying to hit a hummingbird with a garden hose while riding a roller coaster. But there was another problem: the short-range doctrine. The Army aircraft gunnery schools taught a specific philosophy. Do not fire until the enemy is within 600 yards. Ideally, wait until 400 yards. The reasoning was sound on paper. At 400 yards, the pattern of the 50 caliber bullets was tight. The chances of a kill were higher. Also, ammunition was limited. Each gun had maybe 500 to 1,000 rounds. If you started shooting at 1,000 yards, you'd run out of ammo before the real fight began. But this doctrine gave the Germans a massive advantage. It allowed the Luftwaffe pilots to set up their attacks with impunity. They could fly alongside the formation, just out of range, picking their targets and timing their dives. They were the hunters, and the B-17s were the tethered goats. Then there was the issue of the tail. The tail gunner's position in the B-17F was a cramped, isolated box. To get in, you had to crawl through the fuselage past the tail wheel. Once inside, you were on your knees. There was no room for a parachute. If the plane started to go down, you had to crawl back into the fuselage, find your chute, strap it on, and jump. In the tail, you were the lone sentry. You were the last line of defense against the 6 o'clock attack. And the Germans loved the 6 o'clock attack. They would sit in the dead zone behind the tail, where the gunner's view was obstructed by the stabilizers, and slowly reel the bomber in. This is where Michael Arooth comes in. Aruth didn't just see the tail gun as a defensive weapon, he saw it as a sniper's nest. He understood something that the Air Corps instructors had missed. The 50 caliber round didn't just stop being dangerous at 600 yards, it could travel for miles.
Aruth began to experiment. He spent his downtime studying the ballistics of the M2. He calculated the drop of the bullet over 1,000 yards, and he realized that if he could hit a German fighter at 800 or 900 yards, he didn't necessarily need to destroy it. He just needed to disrupt the pilot's concentration.
If a German pilot sees tracers whipping past his cockpit while he's still half a mile away, he flinches. He breaks his bank. He loses his aim. The secret weapon wasn't a piece of technology. It was the psychological application of long-range ballistic pressure. But before Aruth could prove his theory, he had to survive the most harrowing mission of his life. A mission that would see his plane, Tondelayo, take hits that should have turned it into a fireball. A mission where the secret weapon would be tested against 30-to-1 odds. To understand the miracle of Tondelayo, we have to look at the man behind the triggers. Who was Michael Arooth, and why was he willing to throw the rulebook out the window at 25,000 feet? Michael Arooth wasn't a flyboy by birth. Like many of the men of the 8th Air Force, he was a product of the Great Depression. He came from a world where if something was broken, you fixed it yourself. You didn't wait for a manual, you used your hands and your intuition. When he enlisted, he was assigned to the 379th Bomb Group, based at RAF Kimballton. The 379th, known as the Triangle K, would become one of the most decorated units in the war. But in the summer of 1943, they were just trying to survive. Aruth was a sergeant, a tail gunner. In the social hierarchy of a B-17, the officers, the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier lived in one world. The enlisted crew, the gunners and engineers, lived in another. But on the Tondelayo, the lines were blurred. The crew, led by Captain Elmer Elton, was a brotherhood. Aruth was different from the other gunners. While his peers spent their leave time in the pubs of Bedford or London, Aruth was often found near the armory. He was obsessed with his guns. He didn't just clean them, he polished the feed ramps. He checked the headspace and timing with a precision that bordered on the fanatical. He knew that at -50 degrees, oil turns to molasses. He knew that the vibrations of the aircraft could shake a mounting bracket loose at the worst possible moment. He treated his dual .50 calibers like they were extensions of his own body. During his training at Harlingen, Texas, Aruth had been a natural. He had the rare gift of deflection shooting, the ability to calculate in a split second where a moving target will be rather than where it is. But Aruth had a rebellious streak. He openly questioned the instructors who told him to wait until 400 yards. He would say, "Sir, if the Germans have 20mm cannons that can hit us at 800 yards, why are we waiting until he's close enough to see the color of his eyes? Why give him the first shot?" The instructors would give him the standard line, "Ammunition conservation, Sergeant, don't be a cowboy." Aruth didn't want to be a cowboy. He wanted to live. He developed a technique he called the warning burst. He would zero his sights for 1,000 yards. He realized that the tracers, the glowing phosphorus rounds that allowed a gunner to see his stream of fire, were the most powerful psychological tool in the sky. To a German pilot, a tracer looks like a basketball of fire coming straight for your face. If you see that basketball at 1,000 yards, your instinct is to jink, and if you jink, your aim is ruined. Aruth's crew on the Tondelayo trusted Aruth. They knew that when Mike was in the tail, the back door was locked. The Tondelayo itself was a B-17F, named after a sultry character in the 1942 film White Cargo. The nose art featured a woman who was as dangerous as she was beautiful. By July 1943, the Tondelayo had already seen its share of action. It had come back with holes in the wings and blood on the floorboards. But nothing could prepare the crew for the mission to Kassel. Kassel was a vital industrial hub. It was the home of the Fieseler Aircraft Works and the Henschel locomotive factories, which were pumping out Tiger tanks. The Germans defended it with a ferocity that was legendary. On July 30th, 1943, the Triangle K was told they were heading to Kassel. It was a deep penetration mission.
The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, the Little Friends, didn't have the range to go all the way. For a large portion of the flight, the bombers would be alone. This was Michael Arooth's moment. He wasn't just going to follow the manual. He was going to turn the tail of the Tondelayo into a no-fly zone. As the engines of the Tondelayo coughed into life, spitting blue smoke into the damp English morning, Arooth crawled into his cramped position. He checked his ammo belts. He tested the movement of the turret. He looked out through the thick armored glass. He knew the Germans were waiting. He knew they had new tactics, but he had a secret weapon. He was going to shoot first. He was going to shoot far, and he was going to shoot until the barrels melted. To understand why Michael Arooth's tactic was so effective, we have to look at the physics of the dogfight. In 1943, aerial combat was a game of geometry. A German fighter pilot flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 had to perform a complex series of maneuvers to bring his guns to bear on a bomber. The Luftwaffe ace Egon Meyer had revolutionized these tactics. He realized that if you attacked from the front, the total closing speed, meaning the speed of the bomber plus the speed of the fighter, was nearly 600 miles per hour. This meant that the fighter was only in the bomber's kill zone for a fraction of a second. However, the 6 o'clock attack, approaching from the rear, was different. Here the closing speed was much lower. If the B-17 was flying at 200 miles per hour and the fighter was at 300 miles per hour, the relative speed was only 100 miles per hour. This gave the German pilot a long, steady window to aim his 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The Germans believed that American gunners were disciplined to the point of being unpredictable. They knew the Americans wouldn't fire until 600 yards. So the German pilots would set up at 1,000 yards. They would level out, line up the bomber in their reflector sights, and prepare for a precision kill. This 1,000 to 600-yard window was a safe zone for the Luftwaffe. It was the moment of maximum concentration. Michael Arooth decided to destroy that safe zone. The secret weapon was the 1,000-yard engagement. Arooth had figured out the tracer drop. A 50 caliber bullet starts to lose velocity and height the moment it leaves the barrel. At 1,000 yards, the bullet would drop significantly. Most gunners saw this drop and thought, I can't hit him. Aruth thought, I'll just aim higher. He practiced arching his fire. By aiming several feet above the approaching fighter, he could make his bullets rain down on the target at distances the Germans thought were impossible. But it wasn't just about hitting the plane. It was about the tracer effect. A B-17's ammo belt was usually loaded with a ratio, 4 armor-piercing incendiary rounds to 1 tracer. The tracer was a pyrotechnic charge in the base of the bullet. It burned brightly, allowing the gunner to see the path of his fire. When Michael Arooth opened fire at 1,000 yards, the German pilot suddenly saw fireballs screaming past his canopy. Imagine you are a German pilot. You are 22 years old. You've been told that American gunners are poorly trained and won't fire until they're close. You are focusing on your sights, trying to line up the bomber's wing route. Suddenly, the sky around you is filled with glowing white-hot lead. Your brain screams, "He's got me." You don't wait to see if the bullets are actually hitting. Your survival instinct takes over. You brake, you roll the plane, you dive, you lose your energy in your position. By the time you recover and try to set up again, the bomber formation has moved. You have to start the whole process over. Meanwhile, you're burning precious fuel. Arooth's secret weapon was the disruption of the German pilot's decision-making loop. By firing early, he forced the German pilots to stay in the observation phase. They could never get to the decision phase with any precision. On the Tondelayo, this tactic was about to be put to the ultimate test. It wasn't just about Arooth's skill, though. There was another factor at play, a factor that would only be discovered after the mission, a secret weapon of another kind, hidden inside the very shells the Germans were firing at them. While Michael Arooth was preparing his guns in England, Hundreds of miles away, in a slave labor munitions factory in occupied Czechoslovakia, a group of starving prisoners were waging their own war. They were being forced to manufacture the 20mm shells for the Luftwaffe's cannons. They knew these shells were destined to kill Allied airmen. So they did the only thing they could. They sabotaged the fuses. They filled the shells with sawdust instead of high explosives. They left out the primers. They were risking their lives for a secret weapon of silence, a shell that hits but doesn't explode.
On July 30th, 1943, these two secret weapons, Michael Arooth's long-range sniping and the Czech prisoner's silent sabotage, would converge in the skies over Germany. The result would be one of the most incredible survival stories in the history of aviation. The briefing room at RAF Kimballton was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. The 379th Bomb Group was gathered, hundreds of men in fleece-lined flight jackets, staring at the map. Colonel Maurice Preston stood at the front. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said, "Target for today is Kassel. It's a long haul. We're going in at 24,000 feet. A P-47s will take us as far as the border. After that, you're on your own." Captain Elmer Elton, the pilot of Tondelayo, looked at his crew. He saw the tension in their eyes. He saw Michael Arooth sitting quietly, his hands moving as if he were already adjusting the knobs on his turret. Elton was a pilot's pilot. He was calm, steady, and had a preternatural ability to keep a plane flying when it should be falling out of the sky. He knew that the Kassel mission was going to be a brawl. The 379th would be part of a combat box. This was the tactical formation designed by Curtis LeMay. The idea was to create a porcupine of machine guns. Bombers were stacked in high, lead, and low elements, overlapping their fields of fire so that no matter where a German fighter came from, it would be met by dozens of 50 caliber guns. But the combat box only worked if everyone stayed in position. If a bomber was damaged and fell behind, becoming a straggler, it was as good as dead. The Luftwaffe wolves would swarm the lame duck and tear it to pieces. The Tondelayo was assigned to a position that made it vulnerable. It was on the edge of the formation. As the crews moved to their planes, the ground crews were finishing the final checks. The mechanics worked through the night in the rain and cold to ensure the right cyclone engines wouldn't fail. The ground crew chief for Tondelayo patted the nose of the plane, whispering, "Bring her back, Cap." Inside the Tondelayo, the crew began their pre-flight checks: oxygen, intercom, guns. Michael Arooth's voice came over the radio, crackling with static. "Tail guns ready. 1,200 rounds of hello waiting for him." One by one, the four 1,200 horsepower engines roared to life. The vibration shook the entire airframe. For the men inside, this was the moment when the fear began to melt into focus. There was no more time for worrying about the odds. There was only the checklist. The Tondelayo taxied out, its massive tires crunching on the gravel. It lined up on the runway. Captain Elton pushed the throttles forward. The four engines screamed in unison. The 30-ton bomber began to roll, slowly at first, then gaining speed. The wings flexed, the tail lifted, and finally, the earth fell away. They were airborne. They climbed into the gray English sky, joining dozens of other B-17s to form the Great Wing. As they reached 10,000 feet, they put on their oxygen masks. The world became a place of rhythmic breathing and the hum of the engines. They crossed the coast of England and headed out over the North Sea. Below them, the water was a cold, dark expanse. Above them, the sky was a pale, empty blue. But as they approached the coast of the Netherlands, the little friends, the P-47s, began to waggle their wings. They were reaching the limit of their fuel. They had to turn back. One by one, the American fighters peeled away, heading home. The bombers were alone. And on the horizon, Michael Arooth saw the first specks. "Fighters." Arooth's voice came over the intercom, calm and clinical. 6 o'clock high. A lot of them. They're queuing up. The meat grinder was open for business. The moment the P-47s disappeared, the Luftwaffe struck. It was as if they had been waiting behind a curtain. Over 300 German fighters swarmed the formation. This wasn't a series of individual dogfights. It was a coordinated mass assault. The Germans were using a wave attack.
They would line up in groups of 20 or 30 and charge the formation from the rear and the sides. "Here they come," the waist gunner yelled. The sky was suddenly filled with flak, the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire from the ground, and the silver streaks of German fighters. In the tail, Michael Arooth watched as a group of 8 Focke-Wulf 190s began to level out. They were nearly a mile away. According to the manual, he should wait. He should let them get closer. He should save his ammo. Arooth ignored the manual. He gripped the twin handles of his machine guns. He adjusted his aim, lofting the guns slightly. He squeezed the triggers. The tracers arched across the sky. They looked slow, like glowing embers, but they were traveling at supersonic speeds. The lead German pilot, a veteran of the Russian front, was shocked. He saw the tracers passing just above his cockpit. He hadn't even begun his run yet. He was still 900 yards out. He didn't know what was happening, but the tracers didn't stop. They were walking closer and closer to his nose. The pilot's nerves broke. He pulled his plane into a sharp climb, exposing his belly to the rest of the formation's guns. He was out of the fight. Aruth didn't stop to celebrate. He shifted his aim to the second plane. Another long-range burst. Another German pilot jinked away. Inside the Tondelayo, the heat was rising, despite the sub-zero temperatures outside. The smell of cordite filled the fuselage. Spent brass casings were clattering onto the floor like a metallic rain. But the Germans weren't all intimidated. A group of Messerschmitts managed to dive through the long-range fire. They came in screaming, their 20-millimeter cannons blinking like strobes. Tondelayo shuddered. "We're hit!" the navigator shouted. A 20-millimeter shell had slammed into the wing, tearing a hole the size of a man's torso. Another shell ripped through the fuselage just inches from the radio operator's head. But then something strange happened. Captain Elton felt the plane lurch as several shells struck the main fuel tanks. In any other plane, in any other circumstance, this should have been the end. A B-17 was essentially a giant flying gas tank. A single explosive shell in the fuel would turn the plane into a fireball in seconds. Elton waited for the explosion. He waited for the end. It didn't come. The plane continued to fly. The engines continued to hum. The Germans were baffled. They saw their shells hitting the Tondelayo. They saw the impacts. They saw the puffs of metal being torn away, but the American fortress wouldn't go down. The German pilots grew desperate. They began to take more risks. They flew closer, trying to find the kill shot. But the closer they got, the more lethal Michael Arooth became. Now that they were within the 400-yard range, he didn't need to loft his guns. He was aiming for the cockpits. He was aiming for the engines. "Got one!" Aruth shouted. A fighter caught in a concentrated burst simply disintegrated. The wings snapped off and the plane went into a terminal spin, trailing a long ribbon of black smoke. Seconds later, another fighter tried to come in from the dead zone under the tail. Aruth swung his turret down, the metal screaming as he pushed it to its limits. He caught the German in a crossfire with the ball turret gunner. The fighter exploded in a spectacular orange fireball. But the Tondelayo was taking a beating. The hydraulics were gone. The oxygen system was leaking. The waist gunners were fighting off frostbite as the wind whipped through the jagged holes in the fuselage. And still, the mission wasn't over. They hadn't even reached the target yet. Kassel was still 30 minutes away. 30 minutes of hell. And it was in these 30 minutes that the miracle of the sabotaged shells would be fully realized. As the Tondelayo limped towards Kassel, the crew was operating on pure adrenaline. Captain Elton was fighting the controls. With the hydraulic line severed, the plane felt heavy. It wanted to roll to the left. He and the co-pilot had to both pull on the yokes with all their strength just to keep the wings level. But as they looked out at the wings, they saw something that chilled their blood. There were holes. Many holes, and sticking out of the fuel tank area just behind the No. 2 engine were the jagged tails of 20-millimeter shells. They hadn't exploded. In a B-17, the fuel was stored in Tokyo tanks, large self-sealing rubber cells. The idea was that the rubber would close up around a bullet hole, preventing a leak. But a 20-millimeter explosive shell was designed to bypass that. It was designed to blow a hole so large that the rubber couldn't possibly seal it. The crew of the Tondelayo counted them. 1, 2, 3. By the time the mission was over, they would find 11 unexploded 20mm shells in the fuel tanks of the Tondelayo. Think about the odds of that. A single unexploded shell is a fluke, 2 is a coincidence, 11 is a statistical impossibility.
Unless it wasn't an accident. This is where the story of Tondelayo transcends mere combat and becomes a story of human resistance. The Luftwaffe's ammunition was manufactured across the occupied territories. One of the primary sites was the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia. The workers there were slave laborers. They were worked to the bone, fed scraps, and lived under the constant threat of execution. But they found a way to fight back. In the late 1940s, a story emerged from one of these former laborers. They would take the tiny firing pins of the 20mm shells and bend them just a fraction of a millimeter. Or they would fill the explosive cavity with sand, sawdust, or even tiny slips of paper. One legendary account claims that inside one of the unexploded shells found in an Allied bomber, there was a tiny note rolled up. It said in Czech, "This is all we can do for you now." The Tondelayo was being kept in the air by the silent hands of people she would never know. Every time a German pilot lined up the Tondelayo and squeezed his trigger, he was firing a weapon that had been neutralized by a starving worker in a factory hundreds of miles away. The secret weapon was a two-headed coin. On one end was Michael Arooth, the elite sniper in the tail. On the other end were the saboteurs in the factory. Together, they were making the Tondelayo immortal. But the miracle only went so far. The shells might not have exploded, but they still tore through metal and flesh. The Tondelayo finally reached the start of the bomb run. Bombs away. The plane surged upward as it was relieved of its 5,000-pound load. The target was obscured by smoke, but the patterns looked good. The mission's primary objective was complete. But now came the hardest part, the run home. The Luftwaffe knew the bombers would be low on fuel and ammo. They knew the gunners were tired. They moved in for the kill. And this is where Michael Arooth would truly earn his place in history. The tail of the Tondelayo was now a wreck. The plexiglass was shattered. The cold was so intense that Arooth's breath was freezing onto his mask, making it hard to see. His heated suit had failed, and his fingers were turning a dangerous shade of white. And then his oxygen line was severed. At 24,000 feet, you have about 2 minutes of useful consciousness without supplemental oxygen. After that, you become euphoric, confused, and then you die. Aruth had a choice. He could leave his guns, crawl back into the fuselage and find a portable bottle. But if he did that, the tail would be undefended for 3 minutes. He looked out and saw a swarm of Messerschmitts forming up for a 6 o'clock run. "I'm staying," he whispered to himself. Michael Arooth was now fighting 2 enemies, the Luftwaffe and the lack of oxygen. His vision was beginning to tunnel. The edges of the sky were turning black. He felt a strange, dangerous calm, the first sign of hypoxia. He knew he was dying, but he also knew that if he stopped firing, his crew would die with him. He grabbed the grips of the .50 calibers. He didn't just fire bursts anymore. He held the triggers down. He was using the tracers to hose the sky. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove at the tail. Aruth's bullets tore into the engine cowling. The fighter's engine erupted in flames, and the pilot bailed out. Kill number 1 of the run. Seconds later, 2 more fighters attacked in tandem. They were coming from slightly different angles, trying to split Aruth's attention. Arooth didn't panic. He used a technique called the figure 8. He moved the guns in a rapid sweeping motion, creating a wall of lead that both planes had to fly through. One of the fighters took a hit to the cockpit. It didn't explode. It just drifted away. The pilot slumped over the controls. Kill number 2. The other fighter turned and tried to come back. Arooth, his lungs screaming for air, waited until the very last second. He fired a point-blank burst into the belly of the fighter. Kill number 3. Inside the cockpit, Captain Elton heard the constant chatter of the tail guns. "Arooth, you okay?" he called over the intercom. No answer, only the sound of firing. Arooth was now semi-conscious. He was operating on pure muscle memory. He was a ghost at the trigger.
The Germans were now terrified of the Tondelayo's tail. They had seen 3 of their best pilots go down in less than 2 minutes. They began to stay further back, trying to use their cannons. But Aruth's secret weapon of long-range engagement was still working. Even in his hypoxic state, he was lobbing shells at them from 800 yards. The Germans couldn't understand it. How was this gunner still firing? Why wasn't he dead? Why was his aim still so precise? Finally, the radio operator, seeing that the tail guns were still firing but getting no response on the intercom, crawled back through the fuselage. He found Aruth slumped over his guns, his face blue, but his hands still clenched on the triggers. The radio operator jammed a portable oxygen mask onto Aruth's face and cracked the valve. Aruth gasped. The world rushed back in. The noise, the cold, the terror. "Where are they?" was the first thing he said. "You got 'em, Mike," the radio operator yelled. "You got 'em all!" But the tally wasn't finished. As they crossed back over the coast of Europe, a final group of stragglers from a German airfield in Holland tried to finish off the battered Tondelayo. Aruth, now recovered and fueled by pure rage, met them with a hail of lead. He didn't just defend the plane, he went on the offensive. He was calling out targets to the waist gunners, coordinating the defense of the entire rear of the formation. By the time the Tondelayo reached the English Channel, the German fighters had given up. They had lost too many men and too many planes to this one flying porcupine. As the Tondelayo crossed the white cliffs of Dover, the engines were sputtering. They were running on fumes that were leaking through 11 holes made by sabotaged shells. Captain Elton brought her in for a hot landing. He had no brakes, he had no flaps. The plane touched down at Kimballton at 120 miles per hour. It bounced once, twice, and then Elton ground-looped the plane to bring it to a stop before it hit the trees at the end of the runway. The silence was deafening. The crew climbed out one by one. They were covered in oil, soot, and blood. They stood on the grass and looked at their plane. It looked like a piece of Swiss cheese. The ground crew ran up, their eyes wide. They started counting the holes. They stopped when they reached 300. And then they found the shells in the gas tank. But it was Michael Arooth who was the center of attention. The other crews in the formation were reporting what they had seen. They were telling stories of a tail gunner who seemed to have supernatural accuracy, who was shooting down planes before they could even get into range. The official debriefing would take hours. The claims would be checked and double-checked. In the aftermath of the Kassel mission, the IB officers at Kimballton were faced with a problem. Usually, a gunner might claim 1 kill, 1 probable, and maybe a damaged. Michael Arooth and the crew of the Tondelayo submitted a report that seemed like a work of fiction. When all the witness statements from other bombers in the formation were cross-referenced, the number of German fighters that had fallen away from the Tondelayo was 17. 17 planes. In the world of aerial combat, this was unheard of. A triple ace in a single mission? The 8th Air Force IB branch was notoriously strict. They didn't want inflated claims. They required multiple witnesses and, if possible, gun camera footage. After weeks of investigation, the official tally from Michael Arooth on July 30th, 1933 was finalized as 3 confirmed kills and several probables. But to the men who were there, the number 17 wasn't about confirmed kills, it was about disruptions. Aruth had defeated 17 separate attacks. He had forced 17 German pilots to abandon their runs. Whether the planes exploded or merely dove away in terror was irrelevant to the survival of the Tondelayo. The secret weapon of long-range engagement had been proven. The Luftwaffe took notice too. Captured German pilots began to speak of a special bomber with automatic sighting. They couldn't believe a human being was making those shots. They assumed the Americans had developed a new type of radar-controlled turret. This was the ultimate secret weapon, the myth of American technological superiority. The Germans began to hesitate when they saw B-17 with the triangle K on the tail. The impact on American doctrine was equally profound. The Aruth method was studied by the gunnery schools. While the Army still officially preached ammunition conservation, they began to introduce long-range harassment into the curriculum. They realized that a .50 caliber bullet was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one.
They started teaching gunners to fire warning bursts at 800 yards. They began to emphasize the importance of leading the target at extreme distances. Michael Arooth had changed the math of the sky, but for the crew of the Tondelayo, the fame was a double-edged sword. They were now the poster boys of the 379th. This meant they were assigned the toughest missions. They were the ones who were sent to lead the formation into the most heavily defended targets. The Tondelayo was repaired. The holes were patched. The unexploded shells were removed and sent to intelligence for study, confirming the sabotage. But a plane can only take so much, and the miracle of the sabotaged shells couldn't last forever. The crew knew they were on borrowed time. They had survived Kassel, but the war was getting bloodier. On September 6, 1943, the Tondelayo would fly its final mission. It was a mission to Stuttgart. The weather was abysmal. Thick clouds covered the target, making precision bombing impossible. The formation was forced to circle, looking for a gap in the clouds. This circling was a death sentence. It gave the Luftwaffe time to mobilize every fighter in southern Germany. The Tondelayo was hit early. A burst of flak knocked out an engine. Then the fighters arrived. They weren't intimidated this time. They knew the Triangle K was in trouble. Michael Arooth was in his turret, fighting like a demon. He claimed 2 more fighters in the first 10 minutes, but the Tondelayo was a magnet for fire. A 20mm shell, one that was unfortunately not a dud, struck the waist, killing one of the gunners instantly and wounding another. Another engine began to smoke. Captain Elton had a decision to make. They were still over Germany. "We're heading for home," Elton announced. The flight back was a nightmare. They were a lame duck, flying on 2.5 engines, losing altitude every minute. Aruth stayed in the tail, his guns barking at any German who dared to get close. He was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. By the time they reached the French coast, the plane was at 5,000 feet. They were so low they could see the German soldiers on the ground firing rifles at them. They reached the English Channel. The engines were dying. The fuel was gone. "Prepare for ditching," Elton ordered. Ditching a B-17 in the water was a 50-50 proposition. Michael Arooth crawled out of his turret. He helped the wounded waist gunner into the radio room, the safest place for a ditching. They braced themselves. Elton stalled the plane just feet above the water. The Tondelayo hit the channel like a brick wall. The nose dipped, the plexiglass shattered, and a wall of icy water rushed in. But the Queen had one last miracle in her. She stayed afloat. The crew scrambled out onto the wings. They inflated the life rafts. As they sat in the bobbing rafts, they watched as the Tondelayo, the plane that had survived 11 shells in the gas tank, the plane that had defied 17 fighters in a single run, slowly slid beneath the waves. They were rescued by a British seaplane a few hours later. Every member of the crew who survived the initial combat made it back to England. The Tondelayo was gone, but her story and the story of her tail gunner was just beginning to go global. When Michael Arooth returned to Kimbolton after the ditching, he was a celebrity. The story of the Kassel sniper had reached the highest levels of the Allied command. General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th Air Force, personally reviewed the mission reports. Michael Arooth was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and his skillful and determined defense that saved his aircraft and crew. But Aruth didn't want the medals. He wanted to go back up. However, the brass had other plans. A man with Aruth's skills and his secret weapon of long-range engagement was too valuable to lose in a random flak burst. He was pulled from combat duty. Aruth was sent back to the United States. He was sent on a tour of the gunnery schools. He walked into the classrooms in Texas and Florida, the same classrooms where he had once been told not to be a cowboy, and he spoke to the new recruits. He didn't give them Army doctrine. He gave them the Aruth doctrine. He would tell them the .50 caliber is a sniper rifle. If you wait until 400 yards, you're already dead. You hit them at 1,000. You make them afraid of the sky. He became a living legend. His face was on recruitment posters. His story was used to boost morale in factories. although the part about the sabotaged shells was kept secret for a time to protect the workers still in the factories. But perhaps the greatest honor came after the war. Michael Arooth was chosen as one of the elite few to serve as a guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. It was a fitting role for a man who had been the lone sentry in the tail of a B-17. The man who had stood watch over his brothers at 25,000 feet was now standing watch over the nation's most sacred ground. Aruth lived a long, quiet life after the war. He rarely talked about the 17 planes. He rarely talked about the unexploded shells. But to the historians of the air war, his contribution is undeniable. He proved that the human element was the most important component of any weapon system. He proved that intuition and defiance could overcome even the most rigid military doctrines. And he proved that a flying fortress was only as strong as the man in the tail. Today, there are very few B-17s left in the sky. To see one is to see a ghost of a different era. When you look at the tail of a B-17, you see a tiny, cramped space that seems impossibly fragile. It's hard to imagine a man sitting there, surrounded by the vast, freezing emptiness of the sky, with hundreds of enemy fighters closing in. The story of Michael Arooth and the Tondelayo is more than just a tale of combat. It's a testament to the intersection of skill, luck, and the hidden threads of human connection. Think about the chain of events that had to happen for Michael Arooth to survive. A worker in Czechoslovakia had to risk their life to sabotage a shell. A ground crewman in England had to perfectly tune an engine. A pilot had to have the nerves of steel to keep a shattered plane level, and a tail gunner had to have the vision to see a secret weapon where everyone else saw only a machine gun. If any one of those links had broken, the Tondelayo would be just another number in the tragic statistics of the 8th Air Force. Instead, it became a symbol. The Germans couldn't stop the Tondelayo because they were fighting more than just a bomber. They were fighting a man who refused to follow the rules, and a resistance that reached from the gun turret to the factory floor. Michael Arooth passed away in 1989. He took with him the secret weapon of his incredible eyes and his steady hands, but he left behind a legacy that is still taught to aviators today: the importance of situational dominance. Don't wait for the enemy to come to you. Reach out and touch them, disrupt their plan, break their spirit. As we look back at the slaughterhouse of 1943, we remember the thousands who didn't come home. We remember the Black Weeks and the meat grinder, but we also remember the Tondelayo. We remember the plane that wouldn't die. We remember the 11 shells that wouldn't explode. And we remember the sergeant who stood at the back door of the fortress and told the entire Luftwaffe, "You shall not pass." The sky is quiet now. The vapor trails have long since vanished, but if you listen closely, in the wind over the English Channel or the silence of the German forests, you can still hear the echo of the Ma Deuce. The secret weapon is still there. It's the spirit of the maverick. It's the courage of the saboteur. And it's the legend of Michael Arooth.